Hello, and thank you for tuning in to part 4 of the volunteer training for the Amphibian Migrations and Road Crossings Project. This is Laura Heedy. I'm the Conservation and Land Use Program Coordinator at the DEC's Hudson River Estuary Program and Cornell University. This session of the training is going to just focus on how to locate potential amphibian crossings. So if you're heading out for the migration, but you don't know where there's a road crossing, there's a few ways you can try to predict possible locations. I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these, but first and foremost, really focus on using existing maps, aerial photos, and local reports to inform your decision on where to go looking. So some of the sources of information to find potential crossing sites include air photos. They can be very helpful for doing kind of remote reconnaissance to plan your evening out and looking for migration locations. In this photo here, I've circled a couple of wetlands that look like woodland pools based on the signature on the air photo of dark open water with a little bit of maybe trees or shrubs, just a few there in the center it looks like. And the fact that they're also in a forest. And because there's forest on both sides of the road, this might be a spot I would think could be a potential spot where migrating amphibians would need to cross the road to get from the forest to the woodland pool. Good resources for viewing air photos online include Google Maps and Bing Maps. This is an example of Google Maps. Down in the lower left-hand corner, it's a little bit cut off on the screen, but you can see that I've selected, I have not selected the map view. Instead, there was an option to select the air photo view, and that's what I'm seeing here. And the area that says Ferncliff Forest, that's an area that I'm familiar with, but also based on what it looks like on the air photo, I would think, oh, this might be a good location for looking for habitat because it's all forested, which is that brown textured area. And those darker areas are wetlands in the forest. Some of them are small. They might be small woodland pools. Some of them might be large swampy areas. But in general, this kind of matrix of forest with wetlands and some of them quite small looks promising to me for amphibian habitat. And just to give you some contrast, I'm going to pull up an image from Bing Maps. So this is the same location shown in Bing Maps. You can see River Road running north-south there. And so that forest to the east of River Road is the same forest on both images. And it looks quite different on the right because that photo was taken when trees had leaves. So it was probably maybe summertime. Everything is very green and photosynthetic. Whereas on the left, we're seeing the forest probably during the winter or early spring before things have leafed out. And so we're actually better able to see through the canopy down onto the forest floor. But the picture on the right gives you a sense that some of these wetlands look like they're either disappearing during the summer, which would be like a woodland pool drying up, and some of them appear to be getting kind of covered by vegetation, perhaps, lilies growing, lily pads covering the surface of the water, other kinds of aquatic vegetation. So in any case, it looks like there's a mix of different kinds of wetlands in there. So again, just an idea that you can start to get this aerial view just by looking at photo imagery online. And it might also give you a tip off of where you might want to drive your car on a wet, rainy night slowly and carefully to conduct what we call a windshield survey, to kind of look through the windshield, bring a friend and listen for frog calls and perhaps find good habitat where there could be a road crossing. In this case, I think that large extensive forest that continues even further east, the road that kind of bisects there north-south, that might be a good place to go look and see if there's any movement of amphibians. You can also use online mappers, and our program has developed the Natural Resource Mapper for the Hudson Valley, and this might be a helpful resource for looking for potential habitat where there could be crossings if you're not very familiar with your neck of the woods. And so what I have here is on the top, there's the DEC webpage where you can access the mapper, as well as information and instructions on how to use it. I'm going to just go through some very simple steps just to look at a couple of the resources that are available, specifically looking at forest and wetland maps. So when you first start out on the mapper page, you start out with a view of the entire watershed, which is delineated by the blue line. I've zoomed in to a location of interest, but I also could have used the box on the left to search by location and actually type in an address or a zip code. And over in the upper right, in the green bar where it says base map, I actually pulled that menu down and I chose topographical. So now that gives me a chance to see these contour lines. If you're familiar with using topographic maps, maybe for hiking, you might be familiar with how to interpret the slopes. But generally this kind of configuration of contour lines where it looks like there's lots of concentric kind of circular areas which represent knolls with little low areas between them. That's often a good place to find those kind of low-lying basins I described in one of the earlier videos where we see water collecting and woodland pools forming. But sometimes that can be hard to find. So a better tool that might help you find good forest and wetland habitat and potential roads to survey would involve looking at the layers over in the lower left corner that I circled in red. Each of those topics expands to an extensive menu of different kinds of data you can view. I'm going to just focus in on two. So I selected forest layers, and then I selected large forests. And what that gives me is kind of shaded green areas based on satellite imagery of where the land cover is forested. So in this case, much of the area is forested. And if I was to take my cursor and click on the green area in the map, it would give me some information about the particular feature that I selected. In this case, it's telling me it's a large forest patch. It's classified as locally important, and it's actually over 5,000 acres. So that's nice, big forested habitat. So that's a first good signature for me to think, well, this might be potential forest amphibian habitat. Now I just need to look for wetlands. So I selected wetland layers in the menu on the left. There's a few different options within that section. I scrolled down and I selected the National Wetlands Inventory, or the NWI. And the NWI is an inventory of wetlands across the country that's maintained by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And this basically keeps an index of all different wetland types across the country. And so the color shading for each of these wetland polygons is described in the menu on the left. And so you'll see we're seeing a lot of green shaded wetlands, and those are freshwater forested or shrub wetlands, which is what we would expect in a forested area. There's also some areas of freshwater ponds. And if you're not really sure which color it is and you can't match it up well with the menu on the left, you can click on the feature you're interested in. Here's an example. I chose a very small little freshwater forested shrub wetland because I thought, oh, that might be a little woodland pool in the forest. It looks quite small. It's surrounded by forest. And it tells me it's only 0.2 acres. That's pretty tiny. It also tells me the under attribute, it gives me a code, and that's a classification code from the National Wetlands Inventory. You can actually go to the NWI website to look at a key for this classification, but I just wanted to show you that this particular code, PF01E, is actually a good code to focus in on for potential woodland pools. What that means is it's non-tidal, which we would expect because it's not near the estuary and it's not near the ocean. It's a forested wetland in a deciduous forest. And while woodland pools themselves aren't like as forested as a swamp, they often have maybe some trees around the perimeter. They might have some shrubs in the center. And it says it's seasonally flooded. And so that code signifying it's seasonally flooded also helps me kind of build some knowledge about it that might infer that it's a woodland pool. So very useful. On this next map, it's all the same, forest and wetland data that I was looking at before, but I went up to the base map menu up in the upper right, and I changed it from topographic to streets. And this is a pretty rural area, so you don't see a lot of streets. However, if you were trying to find streets, this would be the easiest way. And I see there's a road called Woodstock Road that's bisecting this very forested area with lots of little wetlands running east-west. And I think if I was a volunteer trying to find a potential crossing location, that road might be a good place to survey when the conditions were right. Another source of information are local studies and town maps and town plans. It's not consistent what's available for each community in the Hudson Valley, but it's always worth checking to see what your town might have. And these are two examples. The first on the left was actually a woodland pool mapping project that was funded through our program. And it was focused down in the Hudson Highlands, 2 towns in Putnam County and 2 towns in Westchester County that were sharing borders. And this project actually predicted locations of woodland pools. And even though they haven't all been checked on the ground, it would be a good way to kind of advise where you might want to do some recon. So if you live in those 4 towns, get a copy of that report and look at the maps and use that to help guide where you might go survey. Another resource are the significant habitat maps that were completed by Hudsonia. Hudsonia is a small nonprofit, and they had conducted a number of town-wide habitat mapping projects at a very fine scale. Many of them are in Dutchess County. There's some in Ulster County. But within these reports, there are separate maps for forests and woodland pools. And so the map in the center, all the green areas show where there's forest, in this case in the town of Poughkeepsie. And the map on the right shows where there are intermittent woodland pools, as they call them, with little conservation zone around them. So those blue circular areas kind of show you where those locations are, and the bullseye is actually the pool. And so if I was looking to try to find a place to volunteer in Poughkeepsie, I would kind of line up these maps in my mind and find, well, where is there good forest habitat? Because we know these salamanders and frogs like extensive forest. Where do these woodland pool habitats line up with that forest? And where does it look like there's roads running through those areas that might be good places to survey? And again, I talked about this in the last presentation, but along with checking air photos and existing reports, it's worth just asking around if you have any neighbors, friends, or colleagues who potentially have observed migration activity in the past. I find that people often share stories about where they've seen high concentrations of frogs and salamanders on the road, and that might help you figure out a place to go. And as I mentioned, if you have done some homework, it might give you an idea of where to go, and then you could bring a friend and drive slowly and kind of survey through the windshield for amphibians on the road. And all of this is also described in the volunteer handbook. I do advise you to go slowly. And if you can tolerate a little bit of rain getting in your car, if you keep the windows cracked or down enough that you can hear, you might be able to find woodland or wood frog choruses. And wood frogs sound like quacking ducks. If you can teach yourself what that sounds like, and if you heard that while driving, it might tip you off to where there's a nearby woodland pool, and then you could feel confident that you're in the right kind of habitat. So those are just a few ways that you can kind of predict where there might be good locations for you to survey on the roads for migrating amphibians. Thank you so much for listening in. And the final part of this training, part 5, will give you a very detailed look at how to identify the amphibians that you might encounter during the migration. Thanks so much again for listening.